community not be adversely impacted by all these new city people who are moving out. Well, we took over. We city people who moved out here. But I think that concern was misplaced because we honor those days, and we do that very much this morning. Before I introduce our speaker, just one more comment about why we organized this day. First of all, we're about a year late. We really had hoped, though for a variety of reasons we weren't able to pull it together to do this program last year. Last year would have been the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Jewish Farmers Community Center. It is really now 50-plus years of organized Jewish life in North and South Brunswick that we're celebrating. I knew a lot of the early residents, and some are here with us, and some sadly are no longer anywhere. And it was my sad duty to bury many of them. And I remember speaking to them, often when they were ill, often in the hospital. And I would go and visit, and the question inevitably I would be asked was, how are things at the center? And that was the reference, the center. These were people who didn't recognize, in some sense, that the Jewish Farmers Community Center had become Shari, Sholem, had become Congregation B'nai Tikva. And I became increasingly curious about those days and what it was like. When I first came here, I had a good teacher about all this, a number of them, actually. People who sat down and told me, and Abe Dovin of blessed memory was one of those people. His passing in many ways marked the end of an era in the life of our Jewish community. Leon Horlick, who wanted to be here today but is not in the area, has written a reminiscence of some of the early days, and particularly about Abe. And Estelle Bach has agreed to read it. So before we go further, I'm going to ask that she do that. Estelle?
Good morning. I want you to know that I was very flattered to be asked to read this history. It is so meaningful. Now you hear me. I just want you to know I was very flattered to be asked to read this history because it is a very, very meaningful one. If my voice goes low, just tell me. In September of 1941, a small group of Jewish farmers from South Brunswick developed an interest in organizing a synagogue. At first, they met in each other's homes. At a meeting on November 30th, 1941, a board of trustees was elected, which included Jacob Siegel, George's father, who was president, and the board members were Samuel Berg, Irving Mason, Harry Horlick, Samuel Dorfman, Herman Monhay, Samuel Adler, who was an attorney, Mrs. Frank Weintraub, and Abraham Dovin. The birth of the Jewish Community Center of Middlesex County and its building began on January 24, 1942, the very day I was married in Trenton. A site was purchased for $500 from Samuel and Sarah Burke of Deans. A mortgage of $2,500 was obtained from the Jewish Agricultural Society. The design and blueprints for the building were prepared by a young architect in New Brunswick for $100. The building was dedicated on the first night of Hanukkah, December 5th, 1942, and a very modest building it was. The Hebrew school was started in 1943 and was attended by about a dozen children that belonged to the congregants, or the parents were congregants. Now, Leon inserted some of his very personal feelings, which gives you a sense of how things were. He writes, as I was growing up as a 9 or 10-year-old during this period, the thing that I remember much more than our simple building for the people of our community center. The majority were farmers, as my parents were. But there were also some business people. These farmers worked very hard, 7 days a week, and came to the new shul on special occasions. I remember, though, many impromptu meetings occurring between board members during the day on the farm in between the chores. My conception of these adults was that they were unusually independent and gifted people. What made our shul so special were the elders. They were, to a 10-year-old, such as myself, an extended family. They adopted all of the youngsters as their own. They were truly interested in our development. I remember many, many times when Mr. Vinegar, Nasa Seigel's father, would tell me about being a Jew, or Mr. Siegel, George's father, recalled his experiences. I remember the delightful, fresh-baked cookies Mrs. Siegel always had for us children. I remember Mr. Major and Mr. Schultz, and above all, my father, discussing life as Jews and all its ramifications and responsibilities. And who better to learn it from than those who had immigrated from countries where Jews were persecuted? The elders of our congregation were friendly, warm, loving, and truly cared about perpetuating Judaism to the youth. Today I look back on those times as truly a unique and singular experience in my life. One person from 1941 until the 80s wove a thread throughout the texture that made up the history of our shul. That person was Abraham Dobin. As a youngster, I saw his complete and total involvement in the affairs of our community. He was instrumental in obtaining financing. He planned, he negotiated, and he bought. He participated in every aspect of synagogue planning and building, and I saw him as a very forceful leader. He occupied the position of presidency for most of the first 25 years of this congregation. But he did much more. As a Hebrew school student, I remember him opening up the shul for us on Sunday. He had already turned the 2 oil burners on the night before so that the building could be heated. He would take care of the building, and from what I learned years later, he would turn the water off and hand syringe the toilets to remove the water to prevent freezing. I remember a few times when we had no heat and would have our classes with our coats, hats, and gloves on. I remember Abe being there nearly every Sunday school session. I remember seeing him cleaning the synagogue, fixing things as we were having our classes. I remember attending the UJA dinners to raise money for Israel, and Abe making long, very eloquent speeches about the needs of Israel, as to why we were lost as Jews without a state of Israel, and why we should support it even beyond our means. And he did so, not only by his words, but by his own donations. His words still ring through my ears. Many years later, in the early 60s, I returned to the shul. In the meantime, I had attended college, graduate school, served in the Army, and as a dentist, and I had a family. I returned to my roots and what was now the Jewish Community Center of South Brunswick. And when I came back, lo and behold, Abe Dobin was once again president. My wife and I decided to become involved in the shul. During the next 15 to 20 years, many changes were made. A new name, Shari Sholem, and growth in the area, producing a source of new family members, expansion of the building, our first rabbi, Eugene Katz, a flourishing Hebrew school, a nursery school. This was Abe's pet project. He again was instrumental in getting it in operation and seeing to its success. We joined the United Synagogue of America, and joined the Jewish Federation of Raritan Valley. Another step forward, merger talks with other small synagogues and buying new property. Then, completing the merger with two other congregations and building, and we built a new and modern synagogue, and selling our old building with all of its memories. In each of these advances, there were many people participating and contributing greatly, but none more involved than Abe Belvin. Meeting after meeting, night after night, for 35 to 40 years with enthusiasm, with his clear vision and a strong Jewish community. The end product was Abe Belvin.
Thank you, Estelle. Our initial session here is really, I think, a focus on leadership. The community's leadership from its early days to the present. Before we introduce the keynote speaker for this morning, I'd like to ask a representative of our current leadership to bring greetings to you. Gary Tinkle is our immediate past president, but he and I had a conversation a little earlier this morning. He said to me, "You know, this is wonderful. I see so many faces that I haven't seen in so many years." I think that Gary, in many ways, is the thread that has tied our community together since the passing of Abe Dobin, and having overlapped there, gives us a sense of continuity and a sense of leadership which is strong. And so having moved from our earliest days, now for a moment, greetings from the present. Gary Tinkle.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I consider it an honor to be mentioned in the same name with Abe Dobin. I've been involved in the synagogue for maybe 15 years, which is a small amount for what Abe has done. I joined this community when I first moved out here about 15 years ago, and joined the temple when we first started, just before the merger. And I must say that I'm looking at a batch of folks here today, and I see what I consider to be old friends. When I first joined the temple, new to the area, I just moved out and just gotten married. And you folks welcomed me, like you welcomed everybody else to the community, which is why I stayed here, which is why I belonged, which is why I'm active. So the thread from the farmers community to the present is strong because it kept me here and will continue to keep families here. I'm honored to give a keynote speech here. I'm honored to have you folks here. I think it's a great pleasure, and just stay in this community and help us continue to grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like, because she's not the lead, to ask Rita Burke to come forward. The daughter-in-law of the person from whom we received the land for the first building, also to bring greetings. Rita?
I'm so happy to be here. I'm so glad that Mr. Roller, thank you, left a message on my machine. If I was Rita Burke, who used to live in South Brunswick and now lives in East Brunswick, would I please call him? And I said, oh, I wonder what he's selling. But I called, and I think this is wonderful. It's so good to see so many people that we haven't seen in, I'm not that far away, but we still haven't seen each other in a long time. And I think this is a lovely gesture to the temple, to everybody that had anything to do with it. And I think whoever arranged this did a lovely job. It was a very nice thing. And I wish we could stay, but we do have to leave. So it was good to see everybody, and thank you very much.
Thank you. I have the distinction of being the last rabbi of Congregation Shari Sholem, and the first rabbi of Congregation B'nai Tikva. I was the last in a series of rabbis, and we, this morning, I am pleased to tell you, have the first of that series of rabbis with us, and that's Rabbi Eugene Katz, who came to our community right out of the seminary, and who helped the congregation in its transition from what Leon in his letter referred to as the elders, a group of men who, given their knowledge and training, were able to conduct the services and really see to the religious life of the community, help to make that transition to a new era in our community's religious life, that of professional religious leadership. Rabbi Eugene Katz will always be remembered as the first rabbi of Jewish community in North and South Brunswick, and it's my privilege to introduce him. Rabbi.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm deeply honored to be invited here together with my beloved wife, Nina. I was called about 2 months ago by Rabbi Warmflash, and he wanted to be sure that I was the right person on the telephone when he asked me if I was ever in South Brunswick, or he was looking through archives and he came across a name, and he looked me up in the Rabbinical Assembly Index and he found my name and wanted to be sure that I was the right one, and I certainly did remember. What I said to Rabbi Warmflash in that conversation was that it's very peculiar that 2 nights before his call, my older son, who is now almost 23, he and I were sitting in the living room, and I had pulled out a brochure of old photos, and I came across the photograph, which is up now in your display of the synagogue's archives, where I was elected as the first rabbi of Shari, Sholem. And it's very strange that I was having that same conversation just in the same week the Rabbi Warmflash called me. It was really quite peculiar. I also found next to that photo another photograph of myself wearing a clerical gown and giving the charge to the first bar mitzvah that took place during my tenure there at Shari Sholem. We don't know who the boy was. He's 39 years old now, but he was 13 and stood at my side, and apparently his family sent me the photograph a week or 2 after the bar mitzvah. Maybe somebody can identify him. My wife and I married in 1964, and then I became the associate rabbi of B'nai Sholem, a synagogue in Rockville Center, Long Island. I was there for 2 years, and during that time studied also to be a Moel, and was practicing ritual circumcision at the time as well. And then I was looking to make a change, and the offer came to come to Deans, New Jersey, Shari Sholem, where I was really hired as a weekend rabbi. And the weekend developed that it was really for Shabbos. My wife and I came on Friday afternoon, and we stayed till late Saturday night. Occasionally would stay over till Sunday morning. There were times when we had classes on Sunday as well. Before I continue with our own lives and what's happened to us, I'll tell you a little about my reminiscences here at, or I should say there, over on George's Road, on that property that was bought from the Burks. That year we had we had 4 or 5 bar mitzvah celebrations, and there were classes where we had up to 32 students. And I was preparing children that were bar and bat mitzvah in subsequent months, even after our tenure there. We had Friday night services. We used the Silverman prayer book. I would either give a sermon, I recall, or we had a discussion series. Occasionally, different people from the congregation would speak about their own views about Jewish life, etc. On Saturday morning, I held 2 or 3 classes. There were classes for the older children, classes for the younger children. And then later in the afternoon, I was available, made myself available for pastoral counseling. And there were a number of people who came with their personal problems and situations, problems with the family and in-laws, etc. Those we still have the same kinds of problems. Okay. I'll recall that each Friday afternoon, my wife and I, we still lived in Rockville Center, we bought a barbecue chicken, we bought a potato kugel or something like that, and we came down on the New Jersey Turnpike, down to the Circle, which was on where 130 comes off of Route 1. It's no more a circle, but the George's Road is there. And for the first couple of weeks, we stayed in the local farmhouse. It doesn't give us pleasant memories of that stay, and we quickly made a complaint to the president, and he arranged that for the rest of our stay, from week to week, we stayed at the, I think it was a Lakeview Motel, or it was what was it? Lakeview, was it? And it was about 3/4 of a mile walk from the synagogue, but there were no lights on the road. The trucks were whizzing by. Each time Friday night, it was kind of a terror to get there. We tried to leave the lights on in the motel for Shabbos, so we wouldn't have to turn the lights on. But there were times that we got back to the motel, and the motel, they came in and they turned the lights off. So to save the electricity, I guess, and made it something to remember, certainly. I remember that on Saturday night, we would stop by at Vogel's, Herta Vogel's farm to pick up some fresh eggs to take back to Long Island. So that's another thing that I remember. I'd like to say a word about Abe Dobin of blessed memory, and refer also to his lovely wife Esther, who I understand is in a nursing home. I thought perhaps that she would be today, but I think that she's not here. Is that right? Okay. Abe was a wonderful man. As president of the congregation, he was most dedicated. But one time he came up to me, it was after 2 or 3 months of being in the synagogue, and he said, "Rabbi, I have to confide something to you. I really never told anybody yet, but of course everybody found out. And now you're going to find out." He said, "Rabbi Katz, I never had a bar mitzvah. And I wonder if we could do anything about it. I've never even had an aliyah to the Torah." And I said to him, "Abe, we're going to set a date now, today. We're going to pick the first day of Shavuos." That was in 1967. It was in 68. I came there in 67. It was over the year. "And you're going to have a bar mitzvah on the first day of Shavuos." And we began by learning Aleph Bet, reviewing. He could read a little Hebrew, but he was rusty. And it didn't take him long. 2-3 weeks of review. We were already working on the Haftorah. We were working on tough Hebrew words, where that particular Haftorah was long. And he did a beautiful job. He made a tape, and he learned it. And he did himself proud. There was a beautiful ceremony at Shari Sholem on that first day of Shavuos. He had his family there, his children. He had grandchildren that were present. And then I recall that on Saturday night, he made a party for his family at the Forsgate Farms restaurant. I think that place is still in existence. And the mayor of the town was there. I don't know if he is here now, but on the table was some nice, freshly baked challah. I guess the hotel tried to make the event a little bit with a Jewish flavor. And the mayor of the town was there, and he tasted it. He said, "I never tasted anything so good. What is this?" He had never heard of challah before. So now the whole world, many people have never heard of bagels. But now bagels have gone all through America, and there are bagelries everywhere. The same may happen to challah, which you do find now in some of the Italian restaurants. They like to serve it. I like to also recall a reminiscence of Mrs. Burke. She didn't come often into the synagogue, but it really wasn't until today that I realized that she was very, very particular about the property. I didn't realize that it was her husband that sold the land to the synagogue, so she kind of still felt a certain proprietary connection to the land. She was very concerned that people, when they came up with their cars, it would stay on the gravel. It wouldn't go up onto the grass on her side. This comes to me now, but I realize that the connection is because that was once all hers, and nobody ever parked there, I guess. But she also had a wonderfully extensive butterfly collection. Did anybody ever see that? She had a collection of butterflies. She said she caught every single one of them, and she showed me how she went out in the field and picked one time.
Hanging on the wall.
And she had them on the wall, yes. And she had them all in these glass containers, plastic or glass cases with inscriptions on them. She said she didn't ever buy any of them. They were all she caught herself. She showed me how she would catch them and how she would put them to sleep and right away into the case. It was really incredible. I have a memory about the first high holidays at Shari Sholem. I indicated to the congregation at the time that the high holy days are properly instituted or inaugurated with a slichot service on the Saturday night preceding the holiday. There weren't too many people who said they had had such a slichot service. They didn't remember having it, but some of the old-timers and the farmers said, yes, they remembered it from Europe, but had not attended slichot services since then. And I was very pleased to announce to the congregation that I had invited my father, who is a cantor of sorts, to attend that midnight service on the Saturday night prior to the high holy days of 1967. So I'm proud that my father and my mother attended that service, and my dad officiated at the slichot. After my tenure at Shari Sholem, became the rabbi of a congregation, associate rabbi of a congregation in Long Beach, Long Island, and then I spread my wings to my own community in Levittown, Long Island, where I was the rabbi for 12 years. About 11 and a half years ago, I was offered a position as the rabbi of the prestigious Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx, a wonderful hospital that is known for its specialties in cardiac surgery and orthopedics and ophthalmology and urologic matters. And I accepted that position. My wife and I then were able to purchase our own home, and we now live in New Rochelle in Westchester County, where we've been living for the last 11 and a half years. At the synagogue, at the hospital where I'm associated at Montefiore, we also have a very beautiful synagogue on the premises. It's there next to my office, and in addition to the pastoral work that I do, I'm in charge of the synagogue and relate to the community around there. I also practice, as I mentioned, ritual circumcision, being a mohel, and I was reminded today by Susie Rosenstock that I, and also by my wife, that I had performed a bris. I think it was just one during the time that I was here at Shari Sholem. And that bris was for... Are you here? Is that person here? Well, I'll tell you who it was. It was for the Juro family, and there were two sons there, two boys, red-headed boys, and the younger one was the one of Stephen Juro. There was Adam and there was Stephen Juro that I remember. I recall very lovingly some fine folks that some whose names are mentioned, Sam Schultz and Herta Vogel and the family that I recall, Sarah Burke that I mentioned. I meet today Blanche Fruling, who was in my Hebrew class, sitting here, and Susie and Walter Rosenstock, Leon and Phyllis Horlick, Bert Sitchell, who was your first bar mitzvah from years back, but Bert attended the religious services Friday night quite regularly, I believe. Was your father around at the time? Yes. I believe so, that is right. Leon and Nasa Bible, and Dave and Millie Cutleroff, and George and Helen Siegel. I recall a time when George invited us to his studio, which was on his farm, family farm. There were some very beautiful sculptures that my wife and I had the privilege of seeing. Let me conclude my remarks with and my memories with a reference to the Torah portions that are coming up. We have Achrei Mot and Kedoshim coming up for next week's portions. And we notice that when the opening lines are that the Lord spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to all of the congregation of Bnei Israel. V'amarta aleihem, and say to them, Kedoshim tihiyu, be holy." Speak to all of the congregation of the children of Israel. It's the only place in the Torah where that term is used. Usually the Torah says, speak to the children of Israel and say to them. But here it says, speak to all of the congregations of the people of Israel. And I think that's appropriate for this week, where we have a combination of synagogues, of the tenants, of the Farmers Association, the Shari Sholem, and now B'nai Tikva, people coming together. In your unity, of course, there is great strength. When God said this to Moses to tell the people that they ought to be Kedoshim, they ought to be holy, it doesn't mean that they are to be individual saints. It doesn't mean that we join a congregation so that we become intensely, as individuals, more religious. The idea is for the community to gain a great spiritual power, for the community to become infused and invested with a sense of strength and a sense of belongingness. And in that way, we grow. So I pray that you have found that in your joining together, that you will continue to find it as you reach out and attract more Jewish families, young and old, to come and join, that your community should not be only for a select group, but it should be open and available to all Jewish peoples, however they feel about God, Torah, and Israel. I pray that you will find glory in your future, and that the synagogue will continue to grow under your very fine, dynamic leadership. Thank you very much.
Just a couple of comments. I'm struck by the notion that the more things change, the more they stay the same. I, too, taught Blanche Fruling Hebrew. And more than that, I guess it's a bit more than 3/4 of a mile walk, and the trucks are still whizzing by. But we're going to go in just a moment into the social hall. where again I would invite you for a few minutes to look at some of the memorabilia, after which we will have an opportunity to hear from a number of people who are here reminiscing about the earliest days in our community. Something which I think has characterized our synagogue from its earliest days, and that is the active role of women within the community. I'm struck, as I listened to Rabbi Katz, and I heard about the names of some of the original people who were on the board of directors, that there was a woman among them. Remarkable fact for those days. We are an egalitarian community. We have our roots, it seems, in that kind of progressive appreciation for the role of women. So all of that is yet to come. At this point, I want to again thank all of you for coming. This far exceeded our expectations. I also, we have spent a good amount of time this morning, and deservedly so, honoring Abe Dogan, a man who I have the greatest respect for. But he didn't build the synagogue alone by any means, and I really want that point to be made. There are a number of people here who, through their own efforts and those of their parents, built this community. It's natural, I suppose, when someone leaves the kind of imprint that he did, to remember them in some sense as the spiritual father of a community. But in fact, that was very much a partnership. Our first panel, you see before you, Leonard, come and join us here too. Okay. Our first panel will focus in general, and it consists of Leonard Dermaskin and Blanche Fruling and Dave and Millie Kotleroff and Nesa Bible. I'm going to ask them to share with us their reminiscences of Jewish life actually before the synagogue got started. In the very earliest days, what was it like to live here? What was Jewish life? How did the first Jewish families, what were their concerns? What did they do about cemeteries? What did they do about services? What did they do about meat? And all those sorts of central Jewish concerns. And I'm going to give Millie this microphone. She's holding this hand.
Yeah, I got it. And I've put some notes together which I'll use first, and then we're going to be sort of informal. Each one of us has personal reminiscences, and we're also going to overlap a little bit because we're going to creep into the beginning of it.
David, I'll ask you to begin.
Okay. Now, Millie was born in South Brunswick, as was Blanche. I came to South Brunswick with my family in 1932, when my father and two brothers bought each 4 acres out there on Monmouth Junction Road, which is currently Ridge.
David?
Okay, I'll try to make myself heard. Jews in South Brunswick in the 1930s were a very small percentage of the total population, and were very few compared to the number of Jews in the township today. They were, I believe, divided mainly into 2 communities. We had a number of families living along Davison Mills Road and in the Enverins around there, and then there were a number of people in the Dayton area. No formal houses of worship existed. Solomon Engorn of Davison Mills Road had a small building near his house, which he used as a shul during the high holy days. People walked to this shul from all over the township. The Beckenstein brothers trudged over 5 miles from Friendship and Miller Road near Dayton. Mr. Rothbart with his son Jack and daughter Beatrice walked from his tavern, the White Rose on George's Road. The Steinberg girls and their grandmother, Mr. Seidenstein, with Lester, Blanche, and Evelyn, were also amongst those who attended services at Solomon Engorn's little shul. And the Damascus family came from Church Lane, while Lucas and Rosenfield families came from Luther Avenue. But it was all a small group. Mr. Engorn used to obtain a Torah from a shul in New Brunswick every year, and then after the holidays, money was collected to donate to the shuls for the use of their Torah. For a few years in the late 1930s, services were conducted in the Rosenfeld home on Riva Avenue, and then in 1940 and 41, you'll hear more about that later, a small group began to meet at Rothbart's White Rose and other places to the building of the synagogue. By this time, the population of Jews had grown. Jews from Germany had begun to arrive by 1938 and were placed on farms by the Jewish Agricultural Society. The Burke family on George's Road sold us a piece of land, and with the aid of a loan from the Cranberry Bank and financial assistance from the Jewish Agricultural Society, the synagogue was built in 1942. Here, I'm digressing, I'm doing a little research because Millie and I left in 1940. We worked elsewhere, and then I was in the Army for a while, and we got back in 1946 when we rejoined the community. But as the JFCC congregation grew, we were plagued by some physical problems, as exemplified by the following article, which appeared in the JFCC Tidings in the late 1940s. JFC Tidings was a little newspaper we had. I was the editor. Sam Vinicor and George Siegel and Norman Damaskin were my assistants, and it was a very lively little paper. This will show you the kind of stuff we used to write. I did this thing after, I call it Well, Well, Well. You'll see why. On Friday, October 8th, the board decided to do something about the well. We were always plagued with water problems. The following Sunday morning, the members met at the well. It was a hectic morning that extended well into the afternoon. See, 3 minutes. Now, what happened can best be described as follows. It was a balmy autumn morning, and a goodly crowd was there. The board had come to fix the well. It was a delusion and a snare. The mighty Burke, you see Mr. Burke, he's involved in here. The mighty Burke had seen them come, and with boots up to his hip, he plunged into the well with a mallet in his grip. Belaboring rock with might and main for spirits to arouse, he cried, "By God, there'll be water here to feed 1,000 cows." The blows were struck, a hole was found, a pipe was thrust therein. It's done at last, success assured, but then to our chagrin, the pump had broke its casing. We were foiled in the end. Oh, the excitement's been too much for an older trusted friend. The pump had broke its casing. We were foiled in the end. Incidentally, we've been informed by Sam Deshevsky that the pump had been repaired, but there's still no water. Anyway, there was no organization like the USY, which helped bring young Jewish people together from various parts of the township. So in 1938, the Jewish Agricultural Society, who Abe worked for, they introduced us to the Jewish Rural Youth Association, the RYA, and we under the leadership of and advice of Sophie Dobin, that was Abe's sister. We met at socials at each other's home, planned trips to the beach and to other places and events that were interesting. Several of the friendships were formed, became permanent. Billy Steinberg and Dave Cutleroff plighted their troth as a result of their RYA experience, as did B. Rothbart and Al Carr. Al Carr used to live in the house that was later occupied by Walter Rosenstock's family. They left before they came. A group of Jewish family also formed an organization called the Jewish Country Club. The rabbi laughs at that name. These families belonging to this group were Moses Beck, Sam Adler, Jacob Shore, Benjamin Seidenstein, Moses Squire, Max Kutroff, Sam Cutleroff, Morris Rothbart, Jerushin Steinberg, Millie's father, Abraham Friedman, Morris Kaplan. And one of their first activities was the purchase of a cemetery section from the Washington Cemetery. These cemetery plots are still being supervised by Millie from 1946. She was given the job when we came back in 1946 by my Uncle Max, who was then the secretary, and she's been functioning since. This cemetery section has recently been accepted by B'nai Tikva in the interest of the community. And incidentally, the rabbi has taken advantage of her expertise, and she is also in charge of the cemetery for the shul. And during the early days of the Jewish Community Center, we did not employ a rabbi. We had a group of elders like Louis Stapsky, Simon Schultz, Frank Vinicor, Morris Gibbs, and Sam Damaskin. They conducted services until we hired our first rabbi. It might be interesting to know that they were our problem while we were trying to get a rabbi, because they didn't want to become defrocked rabbis. So we finally prevailed on them to let us hire a rabbi.
Are very vivid. I did not prepare anything in advance, but it just while sitting in the presentation, I realized my memories go way back beyond the 1941 when Shari Sholem was organized. I don't want to duplicate a lot of things that Dave said, even though that's what I had in mind.
Your name, please?
My name's Dermaskin, Leonard Dermaskin. I recall very vividly how Solomon and Gorin had a small one-car garage, and he used to kosher it for Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah. We used to borrow a Torah from a Talmud Torah in New Brunswick. The farmers from the area would get together. We had our minyan. We had our services. Following services, as Rabbi Warmflesh had said before, the women were prominent. Sure, the women were very active in the kitchen, and after services, there was always a spread, pickled herring, sponge cake, etc. We were well fed. We needed it. After all, most of us walked to this shul and had to walk home, and it was anywhere from a mile to 6 miles. I believe even Bernie Gibbs and his family used to walk about 6 miles. These days were very, very vivid in my mind. I recall Ben Zeidenstein and his family, Blanche and Les. I recall the Steinberg girls. And this is how we used to get together, how we got to know our neighbors a little better. Because during the week or during the year, we were all busy trying to eke out a living. We weren't born farmers, we became farmers out of a matter of necessity.
Trying to egg out of it.
We egg out a living. The egg and I used to eat eggs 7 days a week. It's difficult to sell soft-shell eggs. But we would get together for Yontif every year. After several years, I recall that Mr. Engorin got on in years, and it became too much for him and his wife to continue this. And the Lucases offered their house. So we moved services to Lucas's over on Riva Avenue. And then approximately at the same time, I lost contact with Zengorin, and that's when Jacob Siegel and family bought the Zagorin place. The garage, it was directly across the street from where George Siegel lived. I haven't seen George, and I imagine you still live the same place, George? Directly across the street from where George lives. We had services in the Lucas home, which was Mrs. Rosenfeld's parents. And then services were moved over to Camp Lakeview, their lunch hall, because they had a children's camp there. After a number of years, the urge developed where we wanted something more permanent. There was some talk about a shul, there was some talk about a community center, and eventually there was a compromise all around, and eventually the individuals did get together and we created the Jewish Farmers Community Center, which subsequently developed into Shari Sholem, and here we are today.
I remember, as I heard from people the early history of the community, that there was talk about the White Rose Bar involved in the early origins of the community. You know anything about this? People getting together there?
The meetings were held.
That's where the meetings were held. This is now one of these joints on Route 130.
The White Rose was a gasoline station and a tavern. There was a large room, so for convenience sake, individuals would meet there.
I see.
Jack and Morris Rothbart were members of our congregation.
I'm told by Leon Bible, who apparently knows, that it's Virgos these days. I don't ever know how he knows. Oh, okay.
I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't want to repeat what...
Let me suggest, one of the things that I'd like to hear about is just, David, what was life like? David, we've heard about how the synagogue, in its earliest form, what was it like to live out here?
I don't like to think about those times. It brings back emotions. It was very a poor life, and a lot of desires that I thought about and didn't have in those days. And we were all in the same boat, but it brings back too many emotions. I went to the little shul, the Solomon shul, just like Norman did, and Millie and the others. And we used to run in and out of the building because I was young then and I had a lot of energy and I couldn't sit still for more than 2 minutes. And we played. And I didn't pay too much attention to the prayers or anything that was going on, or at least that's what I thought at that time. And we used to walk from the house. My father used to make sure that we went, my brother and I, and eventually my sister. And I don't remember what happened to the years when you went to the meetings at Raw Parks. I don't know where I was, or Lukash.
You would have been involved with your father.
Well, maybe but I don't remember going to any services there. I only remember Solomon's shul. And what I remember in Solomon's shul was at the end of the services, he would give a speech about collecting money for the Torah. And people would put money on the table. But he also spoke about orphan children and poor children. And I used to sit there and listen to his speech and wonder, who are these children? Where are these children? And some of the money went for them and some went for the Torah. And then Shari Sholem was built. And I'll go straight to the Rabbi Katz, who started us on the Hebrew lessons. And Hebrew to me was Greek at that time. You were able to turn the book upside down. I didn't know the difference. And my father had a loud voice, and whenever I came to shul, I always heard his voice. But again, I don't think I paid attention to it. And then when Rabbi Katz started us on Hebrew, he started us on the words, on the letters, and the prayers came together, and I thought, oh my God, this is what my father used to say. This is what I heard. I thought I had never listened, but I heard them apparently. And he was, this was in the late 60s or early 70s, I can't remember, 67, and I think by that my father died in 1971, and I felt so badly about it because I'm sure that he would have been proud that I was learning Hebrew. And while I can't read it, as fast as I would like to, at least I can follow the services on Friday night, which I'm very thankful for. And of course, I think we were in your first bar mitzvah class, Rabbi, and my husband was alive at that time, and I remember him saying, when you get through with this class, I'm going to hire a hall, and we're going to have a big shindig. But of course, he didn't do it. We just had a small gathering in our house. And I'm proud to learn the Hebrew language. I don't know what. Oh, I learned a lot of so-called religion in my home because my father had Passover services, and before Rosh Hashanah, I think he used to shlug kaporas, but he did it with a chicken, and he did it in the kitchen. He made us repeat the prayer, and that we were young, and the words are very difficult for me to repeat, but we did the best we can. And I think he used a hen for my mother and I, and rooster for my father and my brother, and the feathers would fly all around the house. It used to get me so mad. In fact, I think I have pillows home that my mother made. I don't know what else I can, oh yeah, okay, next.
Okay, that was Rev Really cover us.
I'd like to start off by saying that we didn't have what you call a so-called Jewish community. We had 3 Jewish families on Davison Mills Road where I grew up. The Seidensteins, ourselves, and the Warlicks. When I was ready to start school, I went to the one-room schoolhouse in Fresh Ponds that's still standing there. It was 1.5 miles from my home. I walked every day, but I did not speak English. My father insisted that they speak Yiddish in the house because he felt that I would always be able to learn English, but I wouldn't know Yiddish. So I started off to school not being able to speak English. I sat there for a whole month, and I discovered that the teacher had given report cards out to everyone, but I didn't get one. Well, of course, I came home and I cried, and my mother was very upset, went the next day to the teacher and asked her why I did not get a report card. And the teacher said, of course, I haven't heard her say one word. And my mother says, well, what do you expect? She doesn't speak English, you know. But eventually I learned there were 5 grades in that one room. And my grandmother lived with us for over 25 years. She lit candles every Friday night, and every Friday afternoon, as long as I could possibly remember, she made lakshan, noodles. And my mother, you have to realize that my mother and my father both worked extremely hard. We had what I suppose one would call primitive today. We had no electricity, no indoor plumbing, and no water in the house. I guess I was about 13 or 14 before the electricity came down on Davison Mills Road. So life was extremely hard. It was just difficult. But we were not unhappy. I mean, Blanche says she doesn't like to remember those days, but I didn't find those days very unhappy. We were. I had 2 sisters, and Blanche is about as old as I am, and Florence Horlick was the same age. So the 3 of us were very friendly. On the high holy days, of course, as you know, my grandmother, we'd walk to Solomon and Goran's little shul, and just for the 2 days. What else can I say about this?
Let me ask a question.
Yes.
One thing that I haven't heard from anybody is really a sense of how Jews in this community were received by non-Jews.
We were like when I fly in a pail of milk. That's how I would describe it. Well, Blanche, let me say that Blanche and I had different neighbors. My mother was extremely friendly with her neighbors. I never heard her say anything against any of them. She spoke Polish, and she had a Polish neighbor, and she would visit her, and the woman would come to our house, and they would carry on for quite a while. There was anti-Semitism. When I walked to school, I had to walk through a wooded area. And there, the boys, especially the boys, would call me all kinds of names and so forth and so on. When I left the door every morning to walk to school, my mother had 2 words, "Don't fight," as I went out the door. But it was, I guess the anti-Semitism was always there. Every once in a while, you could hear someone, say something. We had an Italian family on one side, we had a German family on the other side, and the Polish family across the street. On the surface, we were all very friendly.
I just want to inject one thing. My mother told me, and of course I don't remember this, when I was in the 1st grade in this little one-house school, I would come home all the time and ask my mother, why are they calling me Kike? And apparently, well, I had, plenty to say too, but there was a family across, living next door to us, and they had about 6 children, I think, and the youngest boy was much younger than I was. And I remember him telling me to go back to Israel, go back where you belong. And I didn't even know who or what Israel was at that time. What? No, I can speak with the town. Well, all right. But he kept sending us back to Israel. And there was plenty of anti-Semitism, and we had a fight. We had a fight for our lives all the time. All right, I just want to say, but somehow or other, we were taught to keep our heads up, my parents. We were always, we were Jews. No matter what I asked my father, because you're Jewish, and that's all we always heard.
Just one little incident. When our son was born and he went to Dayton School, he was about 8 years old, and he came home one day and very upset that he wasn't selected to play on the baseball team. And I said to him, what happened? And he said, they wouldn't play with me because I'm a Jew. And so Dave went over to the principal, and the principal said, look, he says, perhaps we ought to start a Cub Scout group and have this boy involved. Well, the boy ended up in my den. I became a den mother, and the boy ended up in the boy who told him he couldn't play with him, ended up in my den. And as it turned out, I discovered why he was so bitter and why he called him names. His mother was, well, I don't know if you're familiar with Cub Scouting, but they meet once a month. They have den meetings, and they work for an award, like a bear or a wolf or this or that, and the mother is supposed to come and pin the badge on him. I pinned the badge on him every year for 3 years. His mother never showed up at all. And he had his first birthday party in our home. He never had one before. So, after that, he got to know us a little better, and we weren't as bad as he thought.
No, before you say, what Nathan is sitting here.
That's all right.
Everybody else knows twice.
That's all right. My story begins in 1946, I think it was. I think it was the Farmers Community Center at the time. And the people knew that I had been a teacher in New York City. And they said, would you teach Sunday school? I told them I had no Jewish training. I didn't know Jewish as a language. I could speak it, but I did not have any Hebrew learning at all. Well, they said something that happened about 20 years later when I was teaching at Maple Mead School. And Jessie Applegate, God bless her, said to me, we need a Sunday school teacher. And I said, Jessie, I'm Jewish. And she said, once a teacher, always a teacher, regardless of the subject. If you know Jessie, you can just hear her say that. And that's just what happened here. I said to them, I had no background in teaching Jewish or history. So that, but I said I would do that on one condition. And they thought I would ask for money, which I did, by the way. I had a 2-year-old at the time, and I needed a babysitter. So that for the 2.5 hours that I was at the Farmers Community Center, I wanted money for the babysitter, so I was given $1 a day for every day that I taught there. And my teaching consisted more of the cultural part of the Jewish study, so that we had, at that time, stories, dramatization, and play periods. Now, I've gone back in my memory to try to remember who was there, and I found out by listening to the people speak at the other end that there were 12 children. I wish I could remember who they are, because by this time they must be at least 40 or 50 years old themselves. So I have no recollection who was the teacher. I asked
Bert Fischel, if he was one, and he said, you can put me down as one, even though I wasn't there. But I can't remember who was there because nobody in the synagogue remembers those people at the time. And that was for the first year. The second year, I decided that we needed to have more than just storytelling and playtime. So that I asked George Siegel, who was teaching art at the time, if he could come and stay with us for a few Sundays a week during that year, so that we had artwork and the children could illustrate what they were doing. And this went on until we got the first rabbi, or the first person who knew Hebrew to teach the children, so that I was a teacher there for 2 years without any background. Just because I had a teaching license, I became the teacher.
We're still waiting. Leonard had wanted to say something earlier, and then we'll come back to you.
You were asking about anti-Semitism. I never recognized it as an organized movement as such. However, when my brother and I, going to first and second grade, we had to walk close to 2 miles from our home to Maple Mead School, where this infamous Jessie Applegate was the principal, the Führer. She was not only a principal at the grammar school, she was also the Sunday school teacher at the Baptist church on the corner of Church Lane. Very much imbued in Christianity. However, I recall very vividly that my brother and I were continuously, and I mean continuously, the subject of being isolated, being picked upon. With chickens, there's a pecking order. With kids, there's also a pecking order. My brother and I weren't the aggressive ones. Others were aggressive. They keep picking on us. Why? Because we're Jewish. We're different. We're Jewish. And out of self-defense, I had to learn to become aggressive and to fight back and protect my brother and my better interests. Fortunately, at that time, Max Baer was the heavyweight champion of the world. I used him as my idol. Tried to do as Max would have done. But this was the first introduction to my really knowing I'm different. I'm a Jew. How do I know it? Because I'm being isolated and picked upon. And that carried me all through school. Whenever there was a new kid in school, he would be sigged on me by the others because I'm the Jew. And as a result, I was often called up before this Jessie Applegate, the principal, because I'm involved in a fight. It was a matter of self-preservation. I had little choice. Either that be beat up, and I wasn't going to be beat up.
Well, I won't be long. I was going to say the same thing. We came out here, I was 13 years old, and I started high school. I never went to the elementary schools here, but I had some friends. They weren't Jewish, but we got along. But there were some rednecks who constantly called behind me, and I was constantly fighting. When I first started this business, I was a little fat kid at 13, and I got beat up a lot. But after a while, I began to grow, and I began to beat them up, and after a while, they let me alone. But it was an experience I remember. It wasn't, as you say, it wasn't an organized anti-Semitism. It wasn't the result of the German business. It was just kids who were just like that, and I had to finally show them that they wouldn't leave me alone.
What I'd like to ask, as we look back now to the earliest periods in this community, if anyone here has any questions or reminiscences of that period before we conclude the first panel. Any questions or reminiscences?
Back there.
Yes.